no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about.
A voice that most people, most sane, rational people, smart people, agree is one of the most conservative voices in the state of Wisconsin and beyond.
WILL is an indispensable organization.
The essential mission is to keep the republic.
Well, welcome back to If You Can Keep It, a podcast created by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Joining you now is WILL Communications Director Pat Garrett and WILL President Rick Esenberg. In our last episode, we discussed the immigration issue facing the country and what it means under the Trump administration. Give that episode a listen if you haven't. Today, we're going to be talking about Congress, what the Constitution says about it, and why they might have lost their way. In case you haven't noticed, the White House moves at lightning speed with executive orders and military operations. Is Congress keeping up or are they giving up? Our guest today is former Congressman Reid Ribble, who represented Wisconsin's 8th congressional district for 3 different terms, and he currently serves as the political science practitioner at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. While in Congress, Reid Ribble was the co-founder of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus, and I think he's going to have a few things to say about the so-called People's House. Thanks for being with us today, Congressman Ribble.
Hey, it's good to be with you. Good to see you, Rick.
Nice to see you, Reid.
Rick, I want to start with the first question. We are in a war, an armed conflict, whatever you want to call it. There was a military strike and continuous military strikes on Iran. The president did this without congressional authorization. There has been talk that the War Powers Act should be invoked in some way. Is that something like Congress can do? Is that constitutional? These type of things have happened before. So walk us through that.
Well, it's been a long time since we fought a war in accordance with regular constitutional order, where the president went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war. I think that Pearl Harbor was the last example of that. So certainly you can't criticize President Trump or the current Congress for being unique or doing something untoward for the first time in history. But it seems clear that our constitutional structure, was put together with in a way that was intended to detour a single person from committing the country to war. Well, everybody knows that there are circumstances in which prompt action is required. You can't go to Congress. You don't have enough time. But this doesn't seem to have been a situation like that. Now, you hear the argument that, the War Powers Act sort of justifies this, and that Congress is free to invoke it if it wants. But as is the case with all separation of powers questions, that responsibility that is allocated to Congress is not its prerogative or its privilege, it's its obligation. And it seems to me that under our constitutional construction, Congress has to weigh in on the commitment of the country to war. And so at some point, there ought to be congressional review of what's happening. But as is the case with so many things, Congress is not, it's been defending its right and its obligation to weigh in on this. They've taken, I think, a fairly passive approach, and I don't know if it's going to happen. And I don't think that any court would want to weigh in on this particular issue. This is not the type of thing that courts are particularly good at. It's inherently political. It involves foreign relations, which courts generally don't want to involve themselves in. And so it's unclear that that will ever happen, and certainly won't happen because a court forces it in response to some piece of litigation.
Reid, Congress Congress did vote, I think, and there was a recent War Powers Act vote or resolution to condemn the war. It did not pass. I think there was kind of a bipartisan vote on both sides. How do you react as a former congressman to Congress reacting to basically an armed conflict that's already just begun?
They're doing what they've done over the last 80 to 100 years anyway, and that is not doing anything. When I was in Congress, President Obama went into Libya. There had been a number of incursions that President Obama called up the military. I not only authored legislation to eliminate or reduce his power in that regard, couldn't ever pass it. Every Democrat supported President Obama in his kind of warring way he went about it. In the same way the Republicans are supporting President Trump. It's become just a partisan free-for-all. And Congress has done this not just with war powers, but with tariffs, with taxation, with all kinds of things that they don't want to make a decision on. They just delegate that authority to the executive branch. And they do not jealously guard, as Mike Johnson claims, they do not jealously guard their Article I authority. And anybody who makes the argument, well, you can't go to Congress for this because you have to have this element of surprise. There was no surprise with Iran. They've been building it up for 6 weeks. It's on the news every single night. And everybody knew this was going to happen. And so President Trump should have gone to the Congress and said, it would be way better for my authority if you would authorize me to go ahead and do this and provide the funding up front so that the Ayatollahs can see how supportive the American people are of this action. But he acted unilaterally, like a lot of presidents do, and Congress isn't going to reel him in. It's disappointing.
Are you against like surprise strikes in general then? Are they not, I mean, this is for both of you guys. Are they not constitutional? I mean, like I just would think right away we went into Pakistan to eliminate Osama bin Laden, who obviously there was a declaration of war against Al-Qaeda, but that was a country, its own sovereign nation.
Well, there was an authorization to use military force there in the global war on terror. And that, by the way, continues to be used by presidents pretty frequently. And so, no, I'm not opposed to making strikes that you can make a clear argument in defense of the country. However, what's going on in Iran goes beyond that. And I'm supportive, by the way, of taking care of the Iran issue militarily. I just would be more supportive of it had the process been followed correctly.
There's kind of a theme that it's most salient in the context of the use of military force of, we recognize that there are some instances where the executive has to act because there's a grave crisis and there's not enough time to get Congress together. And we saw that in Congress and in the various state legislatures during the pandemic. We also see this tendency to use this emergency authority, whether it's expressed by statute or implied in the Constitution, which ought to be used very rarely in circumstances where it's really necessary. And the executive takes that and uses that as an excuse to sort of basically govern by decree. And we saw that in the pandemic. And we saw that, an attempt to do that with the tariffs. And we have seen over time that evolve with respect to the use of military force. As Reid points out, this is hardly the first time. This has a long, long history. But that doesn't make it constitutional. That doesn't make it correct. And it doesn't make it wise. Reid mentioned, it would be better if we could have put forward a united front with funding available. I think also from the perspective of the Trump administration, it would have been wise to get congressional buy-in, because if this goes south, and it could, he would at least be able to say, look, both the legislative and the executive branch determined to do this together, right? This is a judgment we had to make. We made it, and and now, we're going to live with the consequences. But that didn't happen either. So this is Trump's to own completely.
An important point here is that it's not even just armed conflicts that this has happened with. There's been a number of executive orders, and whether it's just the president has taken on so much power. I mean, Rick, you've said this so many times. We live in a world now where people are so terrified of the other side winning a presidential race because they basically operate in some sort of very unlimited executive. I think you used the phrase imperial executive before. What should Congress be doing though to limit the maybe there's need to be a willingness, but what should Congress do to limit this power, like limit the imperial executive?
The thing is that, I mean, the framers thought that each branch of government would jealously protect that which was theirs, right? That the Congress members wouldn't see themselves as solely as part of the president's team, but as stewards of an important institution that had to be protected in its own right. And we completely lost that. And, I think Congressman Ribble could probably explain better than I why that has happened. It seems to me, as somebody who's never been in or worked in Congress, that there's a polarization has led to a great deal of pressure not to deviate from the party line. The parties in Congress have become frightened of the president's coalition in power. And so even though the prerogatives of Congress are not something that they should feel free to waive as if that they are there only for their benefit. I mean, we have separated powers, not for the benefit of the branches of government that hold them, but as a guarantor of the liberty of the people and a check and a balance against mistakes. But yet Congress does nothing to defend its prerogative. I'm sure that the congressman will tell me that I'm being unfair, but it seems to me that a lot of members of Congress believe it's their job to appear on cable news in the evening and pontificate. And it's not. It never was. It was never intended to be. They ought to go and they ought to do their job. And that requires them to do some work. That requires them to be an independent institution that serves as an independent check on the power of the executive. But there seems to be only sporadic interest in doing that, at best.
Reid, I feel like go ahead and respond.
I don't think he's being unfair. I think he's actually being accurate about it. And I just want to give a quick historical context to this. Back in the very first Congress, the Constitution gets signed into law. Alexander Hamilton made Secretary of the Treasury. George Washington wants him to find a way of paying off the debt that the American people had due to the Revolution. And so he writes this, Alexander Hamilton comes up with a plan, writes a 70-page document, reaches out to Congress and said, I'd like to come in, sit down with y'all, and kind of walk through my plan because it's going to require legislative action to put this into play. I'm going to read a quote from the book, The First Congress. Alexander Hamilton wanted to be there to answer the many difficult questions that were sure to come, but unfriendly members of Congress had made it clear that his presence would be regarded as an invasion by the executive branch of Congress's constitutionally sacrosanct preserve. So the Secretary of the Treasury couldn't even come in and talk to the Congress about something as significant as this because members of the House of Representatives and the Senate actually felt that Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, which says all, that's the very first word in the Constitution, by the way, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which will consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. And so they believe that that's not your job to do that. That's our job to do that. And then fast forward 30 years when John Quincy Adams left the White House. He had become president of the United States, had the highest position in the land, arguably. And what did he do? He immediately ran for a seat in the House of Representatives because he viewed that's where the power was. That the presidency didn't have any authority to do anything. Congress had all the power. And today, it's like it's an honorary position. Members of Congress don't want to make decisions. They don't want to hold the executive branch accountable unless, of course, there's a separation of parties. If the Congress would flip in the midterm election, you've got a Democrat House and Senate, they would be reeling the Trump administration in left and right in the same way that when I was in Congress, the Republican majority in House and Senate reeled in President Barack Obama. So the only time Article 1 actually holds any water is when the Congress is having a tangle with the opposite political party, when in fact, the Congress ought to be adversarial to the White House for the most part and holding on to their authority. But they don't want to do that. Instead, they delegate the authority. And maybe Rick could talk about this a little bit. This whole idea that Congress can give away its constitutional authority with a simple majority vote, but cannot get that authority back without a two-thirds majority. It's just, to me, it's one of the mistakes that the founders made in the Constitution. You can't add to the Constitution without a two-thirds majority and 65% of the states ratifying it. But yet they can change the Constitution carte blanche by just saying, you know what, I don't want that authority. I don't want to be responsible for imposing a new tax. So, Mr. President, if you want to do tariffs, have at that.
Well, Reid, as I was listening to you there, I was wondering how long it would take for this podcast to reach the white whale of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and that is the non-delegation doctrine. I mean, you've fulfilled every expectation. The problem with the non-delegation doctrine is it had a good year, and that year was, I think, 1938 or something like that. We've seen some interest in the court, and the non-delegation doctrine, of course, being the idea that Congress cannot delegate its authority through a majority vote. The court has historically tried to cabin its doing so by requiring an intelligible principle, but that hasn't worked out very well. Delegations of authority have been broad and basically unrestricted. The current court, I think, is attempting for the first time to deal with these problems through something called the major questions doctrine, which some people think is a constitutional principle. Some people think it's a principle of statutory construction. And basically what that doctrine says is, okay, if what's happening is an administrative agency is trying to use a congressional delegation of authority to reach something that was in nobody's contemplation, like it's a major question that Congress never weighed in on in making this delegation, that the statute should be construed not to permit that. The idea is, as Justice Scalia put it, that Congress doesn't hide mountains and mouse holes, and but that has been successful, most recently in the tariff case. But I think to address the problem that the congressman identified, including this notion that you can give it away with a majority vote, but because of the filibuster, you can't get it back unless you have a supermajority. That this non-delegation doctrine has to be reinvigorated. That we have to go, back to the future, and we need to limit the ability of Congress to essentially empower administrative agencies, and administrative agencies particularly with the current court are going to increasingly be controlled by the president. I don't think that's wrong, incidentally, but I think along with that, there has to be a limitation on Congress's ability to abdicate its authority, because, as I've said before, the fact that the legislative power is vested in Congress is not, doesn't make it a privilege of Congress that it can choose not to exercise. It cannot choose to exercise. The reason that the legislative power is vested in Congress is not for the benefit of Congress members. It's for the benefit of us. We don't want too much power to be concentrated in one set of hands. And so we want that legislative authority to be stripped away from the president. We want that executive and administrative authority to be stripped away from Congress. And that enhances liberty and also I think operates as a way of facilitating cooperation, compromise, and negotiation in a very pluralistic and diverse society in which, we have different thoughts about how our common life should be lived, and separating authority, having multiple decision points, ensures that every election doesn't become existential, and that we can live together in a liberal democratic republic, liberal small l, because we don't fear that if we lose the next election, the other side will vote to eat us.
I do think and Reid, I want you to respond to that, but I have one other question that I kind of want to get out there too. So we've talked about you talked about John Quincy Adams running for Congress, right? But like now what we're seeing mass amounts of retirements from members of Congress who are hanging it up and saying, I don't want to do this anymore. Do you think part of the reason, you may have talked to some of these individuals, like, do you think part of the reason is like, this isn't what I signed up for? This isn't the job. My job is not to go on cable TV, as Rick said. My job is not to win a Republican primary. My job is to govern. And that's not happening anymore.
Well, and they're not allowed to. So Rick talked about Congress giving up power to the executive. Maybe I should mention that members of Congress have given up power to the leadership in the House and the leadership in the Senate. And they don't want to wrestle that power back. There's a pyramid of power in Congress where all the authority really rests in the Speaker and majority leaders. And then beneath them are let's say, get the Speaker of the House and you get the majority leader, minority leader. And then you've got committee staff. All those people have more say than a traditional member. And members can't even pick their own committee chairman in the House. The Speaker does all that. Legislation doesn't go to the floor just because it gets passed out of a committee. It gets stopped at the Rules Committee if the Speaker doesn't want it on the floor. Or if it gets forced to the floor, the Speaker will rig the rules so that nobody can amend it or perfect that legislation. And so as the leadership in the Congress continues to remove power away from members, making them just a rubber stamp for whatever they want to do, which is often driven by partisan politics rather than policy, then they feel, well, why do I need to be here? I'm not allowed to legislate. And we'll hear past speakers talk about, well, the House or the Senate's the ultimate place of merit. And this is all bogus. That the only merit that they really believe in is your ability to fundraise. If you can do a lot of fundraising, you can move up the food chain of power in the House. But that doesn't help legislation. That doesn't make for good policy. And what we need to do is flip that pyramid of power upside down, have the members in charge of things, and let that great wisdom of the crowd filter through the system and let the will of the House and the will of the Senate work. But leadership doesn't want to do it that way.
Was there a speaker that you think did that better than other people in the modern era? Are you talking about Paul Ryan? Are you talking about John Boehner, Nancy Pelosi?
Ryan and Pelosi ran the House very much in the same way that Mike Johnson is doing it, in that it's a very top-down system of governance. Lots of closed rules and everything being directed by the Speaker, often legislation written by the Speaker. John Boehner was a big believer in what was called the Hastert Rule, where things could come to the floor of the House as long as it had the support of the majority of the majority. So we didn't necessarily have to pass everything as a Republican bill. We just needed to make sure that we had the majority of our members support legislation. And when I'll just break away from that a little bit to give you an example. The Senate in 2013 had that Gang of Eight that passed a major comprehensive immigration reform bill. And that had support of the majority in the House. So John Boehner was willing to bring it to the floor. Now, it never got to the floor because a member decided that to threaten the Speaker and say, if that comes to the floor, I'm going to do a motion to vacate the chair. Ultimately, Mark Meadows did that, and John Boehner left the speakership. And then we couldn't find a speaker, and then Paul Ryan almost became speaker by default. And in reality, to get control of the House, he said, we're going to pass things only when we have 218 votes to pass it ourselves. And that's just no way to govern. Let the will of the House work. That way, every single citizen is represented, and their voice gets heard via their proxy in the Congress.
Going back to the Hastert rule, that's what we should do. That seems like the best solution so far I've heard.
That's one solution. Go back to the Hastert rule. Another solution is to have members of the committees select their own chairperson. Because right now, the Speaker of the House is telling the chairman what he or she can or cannot do. And that chairman ought to be subject to the members, not the Speaker.
What do you think about these calls to return to regular order, whatever that means?
Well, I would love to see that. Now, people will say, well, then everything will slow down and get bogged up. Well, what's the Congress done? I mean, you can't slow it down much more than it already is. And so we should return to regular order, because that's when voices actually get heard. How do you, Rick, as a citizen, or you, Pat, as a citizen, actually have your voice heard in the Congress of the United States? You get it heard via your elected representative. But if your elected representative has no say, then your voice is silent. And so that's why it's so important to return to regular order, so that every American's opinion actually gets heard.
The other thing I think we see is that people who, I don't know how you get there. It seems to me that one of the things that happens is that, anybody who's any good, well, not this is an overstatement, but a lot of the people who are really good that get elected to Congress get frustrated and they leave. Like, how long were you there?
I was there 3 terms.
Not that long, and then, Mike Gallagher, how long did he stick around? And I just think you get frustrated. And as you describe, you just think, like, why am I here? I could be doing something else. I wouldn't have to be in Washington, D.C. And they wind up leaving.
Right. It's a very frustrating place to work, because the leadership has demoted the elected official to be the weakest person in the House chamber. Even though you've got the voting card, your staff has more say than you do. And so they need to return the power all the way back to the individual members. And that's going to require members who are brave enough to wrestle that power back from the leadership and say, we're going to go back to regular order, even if that means things pass the House that we don't agree with. That's how you inject moral hazard back into decision making and return this to an actual republic form of government. And because the House of Representatives is among the least democratic places to work in the country.
Do you have an example of a congressman or congresswoman who has successfully done this in the last couple of months, years? And if you don't want to name them.
Successfully done what?
I would say, or at least fought to wrestle power back.
I think you saw part of this in the big debate when Kevin McCarthy was elected speaker. Remember that this went round and round and round before he finally got the votes. And in the meantime, he was trading away his power to acquire the authority to be speaker. And that's kind of the closest example I can cite in the last 20 years of where individual members were saying, no, we want the speaker to allow us to do our work. Now, will that clog up the wheel? Will things slow down? Will mistakes happen or legislation not get passed? Sure. But that's because they couldn't get agreement. And when you return things and power back to committees and they get to really wrestle deep with issues, they're likely to come up with a reasonably decent solution for it. But when it's all managed from the top, from the speaker's office, that's one person deciding for everybody how it's going to be. And that's a very dangerous place to be.
I want to talk about a couple other practical examples here that, solutions that people throw around a lot. One of them is filibuster reform, and we briefly talked about it. I think if the filibuster, and what I mean by the filibuster right now is this idea that you can basically hold things up for 60 votes. It's not the talk forever and hold it up until you're done talking. We've seen that is the more literal use of the filibuster. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that can stay for as long as possible because that's grounded in Senate rules and the Constitution. But the filibuster and how it's used now, if that were to go away, would that help solve some of these problems?
No, I don't. I personally don't think so. Maybe Rick and I disagree on this. I'm not sure because we've not spoken about it. But my take is if you get rid of the filibuster, all you're going to do is create another House of Representatives, just a smaller body. And the House of Representatives is already dysfunctional. There's no way that anybody in the minority has any say in our government absent that filibuster. Then it literally is the majority lording over the minority. And the Senate can change those rules. The Constitution allows each chamber to establish their own set of rules by how they operate. And if they want to, they could change it. But I think that the 17th Amendment to the Constitution was a mistake. And I think getting rid of the filibuster would be a mistake if you really want government of, by, and for the people. That would be my take.
I think that the filibuster serves an important role in encouraging consensus. And I think that, again, in a society that's as pluralistic and diverse as ours, that's important. We don't want a system in which, 51% of the people can vote to do whatever they want to the other 49%, even given, explicit constitutional safeguards. And so, and one of the problems with concentrating too much power in the executive is that can happen, or at least we can get closer to that. On the other hand, it does make it harder to do things, particularly if a filibuster doesn't really require any effort. It's not, I always use the term like a real man or real woman's filibuster, like Jimmy Stewart getting up there and but the problem is that the vision of a Congress where there would be actual deliberation and actual movement on legislation that requires a whole set of preconditions before you get rid of the filibuster, as the congressman pointed out, that you got to have people there who actually want to do their jobs. And I don't know that you have that right now. I just all the incentives are wrong. I mean, you mentioned Congressman, that the most valuable thing that a member can have is the ability to fundraise. Well, the ability to fundraise, the skill set that comes with fundraising is not always the skill set that comes with being able to be an effective legislator. I mean, two different things, really.
That's correct. And what I think there's a really great example right now going on, Rick, with the SAVE Act, the voting registration bill that has been passed the House and now it's in the Senate. And John Thune's been somewhat reluctant to bring it up because he doesn't have the votes. And what you have now is the majority leader in the Senate is protecting his majority by not forcing them to vote on a bill that some of them disagree with. Some of them would say that the SAVE Act is unconstitutional, that it's a takeover out by the administration, the federal government, over states' rights. States get to decide those things. And it's really a voter registration bill. It's not a photo ID bill, which is how they're trying to present it on television and CNN. Well, everybody needs photo ID. You can't go on an airplane without photo ID. And most Americans believe that. But that's not what this is. And so even though I think we need to tighten up the identification of voters, I'm not 100% sure that this bill is going to do what they think it's going to do, but I'm more inclined to always defer under the 10th Amendment to the states and let them have the authority that was given to them. And I think Ms. McConnell knows that there's 4 or 5 members who have a philosophical and constitutional disagreement with the federal government seizing more power over our election system, and they don't want to vote for it. So he's trying to protect the majority in this case.
What would you say, though? Like, JD Vance would get up and respond if he was on this podcast. He would say, they're either we do this now and use this method to protect our elections, or the Democrats will do it to go the other way. And I know that that's probably like the exact toxic politics that's plagued Congress. But I think a lot of conservatives value that discussion. So what would be your response?
Well, first of all, my response is they've been saying that for 50 years about the filibuster. Boy, if the Republicans don't get rid of the filibuster, then Democrats will. And yet we're still here. The filibuster's still there, and so I think making an argument based on fear is a little bit silly in and of itself.
I'm a comms person, so I obviously have to inject a little bit of that into this.
Right. Well, I get it because that's how it works. But the reality is that I don't think that you do it simply because the other side will. And I would argue this: if our elections are so screwed up as they claim that they need all these federal protections, how in the world did the party who has full control of the House, the Senate, and the White House get elected in 2024?
Oh, it's a great, yeah, no, it's a point you can easily make when you talk about the election being stolen. 100% is like we just had the 2024 election. President won.
The other reason that Pat brought that up, Reid, is that he knows that Rick is triggered by the phrase, "You don't know what time it is." The idea that we have to destroy our principles in order to save them.
Right, exactly. And listen, I get there are methods that the Senate can move legislation with a simple majority through a process called budget reconciliation. That's how the one big beautiful bill got passed. But that is somewhat restricted on the types of things they can put in there.
Yeah, I think we've seen, budget reconciliation be used to pass very fiscal things, and that has happened. And I think both sides have taken advantage of that. And I do think it's a really good point, is the Democrats have been presented multiple times to get rid of the filibuster, and they have not. And so it is something to think about. I mean, for sure. Like the argument that Vance is going to make, it doesn't necessarily bear out when you think about how Democrats, when they've controlled the Senate for the last, multiple times during the last 20 years, have acted.
And the reality is, whatever you do to weaken any type of bipartisan action in the Senate will come back to bite you when the other party has the majority. So you should move very, very carefully in doing those types of things because you want something right now or because the president gets on his bully pulpit.
One topic too I wanted to get to was this idea, you see it on the campaign trail today, running on term limits, and this idea that if we would just limit, you serve 3 terms, right? That's 6 years, or let's say it's 3 terms in the House and 2 terms in the Senate, is term limits a solution that could help Congress get back to its kind of constitutional driven intent?
Well, I like term limits just because I think having some churn of people is good, and I imposed a term limit on myself and walked away from that job. But at the end of the day, there's term limits in the Constitution already. Every single Congress ends. There's a date certain that this Congress will end, and there's a date certain that the American people can weigh in. And people love term limits when you're campaigning on it. That's why members campaign on it. But what I discovered, I campaigned on term limits and kept my word. Well, at that point, I was fairly popular in the district, and people didn't want me to term limit myself. Then actually, you turned out to be okay, so we want to keep you there. And that's the problem. The system is rigged for incumbents, and so having term limits would maybe help clear things up, but you also lose a lot of institutional knowledge, and the non-elected people in Congress who already have too much power would be even more empowered by it. And so I'm not sure I want a law to enforce it.
I mean, Rick, I'd be curious if you think what you think about this, because I look at it from the staff side, and I think term limits have an unintended consequence of empowering people. Like, Congressman Ribble's chief of staff would basically help pick the next person for the seat.
Right. It becomes the member becomes staff captive because by the time you get up to speed, you got to go.
No, absolutely. And so, but we did talk about a little bit about incumbent protection. Rick, before you got on, we talked a little bit about McCain-Feingold. And I want to talk about the idea of contribution limits and Citizens United. Obviously, money drives politics. We talked about that. But what about this idea that term limit or contribution limits are a good thing or a bad thing? I have some thoughts, but I'd let you guys go first.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there are many contribution limits left. I mean, except the ones that are probably those that we should encourage the most, and that is the ones that go directly to the campaign. Because you have basically, and I understand and I don't disagree with the court's reasoning that there are, fatal First Amendment problems with trying to limit the amount of speech. And I've never found the argument that money is not speech to be particularly effective, since it takes resources to facilitate speech. And I don't think the First Amendment is limited to protecting, your ability to, go stand in the street corner and shout at people as they drive by. But I think the idea that there is this great distinction between giving to a campaign in terms of, anti-corruption efficacy, and giving money to a candidate, and then or giving money to an independent committee that is going to support the candidate. And so it seems that given the way that the rest of the system works, an argument can be made that that contribution limits have no longer really serve a purpose. But the thing of it is that I haven't had to live in the system, right? I mean, I like talking about politics, but I don't like doing politics so much in terms of, and so I don't have that experience, and I would be interested in hearing from someone who's actually run for office and had to deal with all this stuff.
I agree. First of all, I agree with you. Citizens United, from a legal standpoint, probably was the right decision. I mean, they probably made the correct constitutional determination there. But Congress does have some power where they can go in and change some of the rules that they govern themselves by, particularly on the campaign side. For example, if there were no cap on what people could donate to them, that's a much more transparent method. Voters could then see it. It's very difficult to track down a super PAC and see who's providing all the money when it's all outside of the system. The second thing Congress could do was to say, if you're a member of a particular committee, let's say the Agriculture Committee, you can receive no PAC money from any ag source. If you're on the Finance Committee, you can't receive any money from Wall Street or the banking side of things.
Reid, who's going to want to serve on the Finance Committee if you can't receive this money then?
Well, yeah, people that actually care about good governance, and so, but you've got these committees that's very easy to raise money. Let me give you a really stark example. The number one thing that the American citizen pays for and the American government pays for is health care. It's the most expensive thing in everybody's budget. And yet, in the House of Representatives, there is no single committee on health. There's no single committee that oversees Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance, prison health care, Bureau of Indian Affairs health care. Healthcare is divvied up among 37 committees and subcommittees in the House of Representatives. And why do they do that? So that virtually every single member can fundraise off of it. That's why they do it. And I tried to create, when I was in Congress, I wrote a rule to change the rules to create a committee on healthcare with individual subcommittees overseeing each of those things I just listed. And it got voted down because people want to be able to fundraise. That's how important fundraising is. If you eliminated the caps on fundraising, you would diminish some of that.
Actually, that's a really good point. Like you wouldn't need to seek out these strong committee posts, which means you wouldn't really need to suck up to party leadership per se, because you could raise $500,000 on your own without the NRCC's help or without the PAC contributions help. And obviously this is a problem on both sides. We're just giving Republican examples.
I remember a member of Congress, a candidate for Congress, was telling me, bragging that the speaker, the majority leader, were coming in to do a fundraiser for him. And I said, you need to get this in your head right now. They are not coming in and doing a fundraiser for you. They are doing a fundraiser for them. They're putting a chit on the table that they can hold over your head the next time they need you to vote for something. And so don't ever think that they're coming in out of the goodness of their heart. They're getting something for this, and you need to wrestle that power back. And going to what Rick was saying, by getting the limits off of what an individual member can raise, you exponentially increase their voice while beginning to silence the super PAC voice. At least you make it a fair fight.
Well, and a transparent fight.
That's right.
Because every every hard dollar contribution is reported. Every politician running for Congress has to report all these donations. I mean, they're all there. And it would like the super PAC stuff. It's like totally different. The reporting on that is just completely different.
Yeah, it's all dark. Horrible.
Any closing thoughts on? We have a segment I want to jump to soon. But Rick, any closing thoughts from this conversation before you?
I'm pretty much in agreement that that the Congress is broken and needs to be fixed. And but how that's going to happen is unclear, because and the consequences of it are horrible. I mean, we have this kind of odd situation where the public understands that Congress isn't doing its job. They all kind of like their Congress member, and they vote to reelect them again and again and again. So there's this kind of this break between poor results and accountability for those poor results. We just tend not to have the latter, and that's that's unfortunate. And I and the biggest area in which we see this is the coming entitlement crisis, which both parties are in denial over, right? Like I'm down here in Southwest Florida, where I am like one of the young people, and and these people that are all around me, they have no idea that their Social Security is going to get cut by 24% in 6 or 7 years. I mean, no idea, no idea what's coming.
And it doesn't have to happen. And I don't know, Rick, if you're even aware of this, but I wrote the only bipartisan supported Social Security reform bill since 1983. And both Democrat and Republican co-sponsors that would have wiped out that entire $32 trillion deficit and properly funded that program for the next 75 years. And I couldn't get the leadership to even consider doing a markup on it.
You hear this phrase now on the internet about total boomer luxury communism.
Yeah.
And what I find ironic is that I probably have already said this on this podcast, but I remember being a young lawyer in the 1980s, and I was just up in arms about the fact that Social Security was unsustainable. It was going to run out of money. We knew it 40 years ago. And these geezers were going to have to give up some of their benefits in order to make this thing work. And I would not have dreamed in 1984 or whenever that was that I would become one of those geezers, and nothing still would have been done about it. And so you fought the good fight, but unfortunately,
nothing's been done. They're going to wait till there's a crisis, and when the crisis comes, it'll be way more expensive to fix. And that's just how Congress works, because they're afraid of their own shadow. When both young people and senior citizens require a fix to this program.
Well, I want to end our episode with our segment we've been introducing the last couple episodes, which is this idea that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. I think based on the episode today, we got a lot of great historical references. I feel like our guests should have no problem. But we'll start with Rick, just to give Reid some time to think about the answer. Rick, as it relates to Congress or not, give us a moment in history we are doomed to repeat.
I mean, I think the best I can say is that we're treating populism and populist anger as something new, and something that sort of ushers in a new era of politics. And in fact, that's not true. That populism is something that sort of asserts itself again and again and again in American history. And while it often raises an issue that needs attention and sort of absorption by mainstream politics, it always exhausts itself. There are no exceptions. And I think right now we're refusing to see that this populism on the right, but also on the left, will also exhaust itself. And then at some point, we're going to have to understand that our institutions are there for a reason. The rule of law is there for a reason, and that we ought not lightly abandon it because we think we've discovered something new and better than what we've had before.
The nice optimistic close.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, Donald Trump kind of fancies himself as a Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt type of populist. But those eras faded in about 20 years, as did every populist cycle that the U.S. has gone through. They come in and people finally understand that populism is a politic of outrage, and people only want to be mad for so long. That's why this James Tallarico is gaining so much popularity down in Texas, because he's just a generally nice person, and people say, "I want niceness again." But I think if we're going to repeat something today, we're most likely going to be repeating the presidency of Herbert Hoover, and I think that's probably the closest example to President Trump is Herbert Hoover. Ushered in Smoot-Hawley tariffs, threw the country into a Great Depression. Roosevelt was unable to get out of it because he had a tendency to double down on the bad policies of Herbert Hoover, and I'm concerned that might be the closest thing that we see happen is a repeat of the 1930s, and so that would be my take.
That's the pessimism that comes before the optimism.
Yes, much less optimistic, but we got through that, right? And this is the great thing about this great American experiment, is that through every travail and trial that the country's gone through, they've always come out of it. And I believe our institutions are such that they'll stand and will come out of whatever moment bad policies and bad politicians bring to us.
Fantastic episode talking about Congress and how in some ways it's lost its way, but in some ways the Constitution can really provide a roadmap forward. So I really appreciate former Congressman Ribble and, of course, Rick and President of WILL, Rick Esenberg, joining us today. You know where to find us at this point, will-law.org/podcast, and anywhere you get your podcast. So thanks again. Appreciate it.